Napoleon Part 3. The French Invasion of Russia, 1812, where victory no longer meant victory. If you look at the map in September 1812, you will see something very difficult to understand. Napoleon did something that almost no one had ever done. He advanced into the very heart of Russia, captured Moscow, and the Russian army continuously retreated before him. And yet, just 3 months later, that very army almost disappeared from history. The problem was not that he lost a battle. The problem was he won, but no longer had a way to end the war. After the Treaty of Tilsit, Napoleon and Alexander I of Russia were, in theory, allies. But this was an alliance based on coercion rather than shared interest. The core conflict lay in the continental system. Napoleon needed it to strangle Britain. Russia was strangled by it instead. From 1810, Russia began to reopen trade with Britain in a controlled manner, which meant breaking Napoleon's entire economic strategy. From Napoleon's perspective, this was not a policy adjustment. This was a sign that his system was beginning to crack. And if a major link like Russia broke away, the entire power structure he had built since 1805 could collapse in a chain reaction. Therefore, the decision to invade Russia in 1812 was not simply punishment. It was an attempt to force all of Europe back into his orbit. And that is when the problem begins. The greatest strength and the greatest burden. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon led approximately 600,000 troops across the Niemen River into Russian territory. This was the largest force he had ever commanded, but it was no longer a purely elite French army, but a multinational coalition with uneven quality and an extremely complex logistical system. Napoleon's initial plan was very familiar. Advance quickly, force the Russian army to fight near the border, fight a decisive battle, and then compel Russia to negotiate, just as he had done with Austria and Prussia. But from the very first weeks, that plan began to deviate. The Russian army under Generals Barclay de Tolly and later Mikhail Kutuzov did not attempt to hold territory. They continuously retreated deeper, avoiding encirclement while destroying supply depots and infrastructure behind them. This created a very unusual situation. Napoleon was still advancing, still capturing land, but could not force the enemy into a decisive battle. The distance from the French rear stretched hundreds of kilometers, while local supplies were almost non-existent. This was the point where the campaign began to shift from maneuver warfare to attrition warfare, a form of war that Napoleon's system was not designed to handle. Such Smolensk. The first opportunity slips away. In August 1812, at Smolensk, Napoleon finally reached a Russian force large enough. He expected this to be the first decisive battle. French troops attacked the city for several days, causing significant damage. However, instead of being fixed and destroyed, the Russian army once again withdrew in an organized manner, leaving behind a burning city. Napoleon captured Smolensk, but failed to achieve the most important strategic objective, destroying the main Russian army. And from this moment, he faced a very difficult choice: stop to consolidate logistics, or continue deeper to seek a decisive battle. He chose to continue. Borodino, the largest battle, but not a decision. On September 7, 1812, at the Battle of Borodino, two armies with a combined total of over 250,000 soldiers entered the largest battle of the entire campaign. Moscow. The objective achieved, but the purpose failed. On September 14, 1812, Napoleon entered Moscow. In the logic of European warfare, capturing the capital was almost equivalent to forcing the enemy to surrender. Napoleon waited for a negotiation offer from Alexander I, but that never happened. Moscow was abandoned and then burned. leaving the French army unable to use the city as a logistical base for the winter. More importantly, Russia's refusal to negotiate completely broke the campaign logic Napoleon had relied on. He had achieved the military objective, capturing Moscow, but failed in the political objective, forcing Russia to surrender. And in the end, war is always a tool that serves political goals. By October 1812, it was clear that Russia would not negotiate. Napoleon had no choice but to retreat. And this is where the real war begins. Winter arrived early. Temperatures dropped drastically. Roads froze. Food supplies collapsed. Continuous cavalry attacks from Russian forces stretched and fragmented the retreating columns. The French army was no longer a unified fighting force. It became a chain of survival groups. In late November at the Borodino River, French forces faced encirclement from multiple Russian armies. Under extreme conditions, they carried out a chaotic river crossing. Engineers built bridges, while troops held off attacks, allowing part of the army to escape. Napoleon retained a core force, but most of the army was lost. The campaign did not end with a single decisive defeat, but with the gradual collapse of the entire system. Out of more than 600,000 men, only a fraction returned. After 1812, Napoleon was no longer in a position of strategic offense. He could still rebuild armies, still win individual battles, but absolute superiority was gone. Russia, instead of being subdued, became the center of a new alliance, the Sixth Coalition. Britain, Prussia, and later Austria joined. What changed was not just numbers, it was perception. Before 1812, Napoleon was seen as unstoppable. After 1812, he became an opponent who could be defeated if coordination was strong enough. In 1813, Napoleon would return to Germany with a new army. He would still win impressive battles, but this time, the problem was no longer tactics. He was facing something he had never faced before, a coalition that had learned not to fight by his rules. And the question is no longer whether Napoleon can win another battle, but whether a military genius can survive when the world has learned how to fight against that genius.
When the world has learned how to fight against that genius. Because after Russia, something had shifted. Not on the map, though the map had changed. Not in numbers, though his army was no longer the same. But in the minds of his enemies. For years, they had faced Napoleon like a force of nature. Unpredictable, unstoppable. But now, they had seen the limit. They had seen an army march into the heart of an empire and fail to end the war. They had seen victory turn into survival. And that changes everything. Because once an enemy believes you can be defeated, they stop fearing you. And once they stop fearing you, they start thinking. And when they start thinking together, they become something far more dangerous than any single army Napoleon had ever faced before. In 1813, this would no longer be a war of speed or brilliance or a single decisive battle. It would become a war of endurance, of coordination, of pressure that never stops. And for the first time in his career, Napoleon would not be dictating the war. He would be responding to it. Step by step, decision by decision, until the question was no longer how he wins, but how long he can keep from losing everything. And that is where the next phase of the war begins. A campaign where Napoleon will win and still lose everything. The German campaign of 1813.